Let's look at the initiate and decide phase of the user requirements process. In this, you're trying to decide what format you're going to record the requirements in and how you're going to go about determining all of the requirements that you need to determine to make a decent job of it. We'll start with the format. There are differing formats. Some of them are more formal than others. The minimal formats tend to be the user-centered one, where you talk about user narratives, and there you describe a situation from the perspective of the user. This tells you what the user requires. It doesn't tell you what the system requires. To do that, you might go to a system-centric format, which use cases are a more system-centric format, because the task is still described. What the user is trying to do is still described, but the requirement is expressed more in terms of what's going on inside the system. That is how the system should respond. Now, more commonly in commercial work is the narrative form that you might get in a contract, for example, contracted scope of works. Now, this tends to be described that way to conform to the legalities, or it mimics a legal contract. But it's the most common way of specifying the requirements. Just user narratives. The requirements themselves are then listed by paragraph, numbered in some table of contents type way. And that's a fairly general way of doing it. So there are three potential formats. They're not the only ones by any means. Other people tend to write the requirements in tickets, for example, job tickets, debug tickets, that kind of thing. And there are ticketing systems to do that. Now let's look at how you're going to go about discovering all the requirements. Trying to say discover all the requirements is a misnomer, because that's like, how do you know what all the requirements are? You'll only know at the end of the job. I'm sorry, this is the beginning of the job, so you discover as many as you can that seem to make sense. You try to make sure that there's no major gaps in your understanding of the system. Where you can get these requirements from, obviously you can try and ask the customer, the user, what it is they want, what the scope of what they want, what they want the system to do. So you can ask about its functionality and as many of the exceptions to that functionality as is possible. Now, I won't try to describe the entirety of a business analyst's job, but trying to get the requirements in the precision that a computer system wants from people who are more accustomed to dealing in conceptual level and dealing with the exceptions later when necessary. That can be a difficult task. So you can ask the user. You can also look at whatever available documentation there is. Frequently you'll have, regulations, procedures manuals, various other information about how that job gets done as well. Try to resolve the conflict between requirements and users. If you ask two different users what they want, you possibly get two different answers. And part of your job in the requirements analysis is to try and resolve the conflicts between both those who specify the requirements and between the requirements themselves. So that's part of your job. You also should think about how you're going to manage the requirements, because the requirements will change over time. As people learn more about it, there will be changes. Now, how are you going to manage that? How are you going to know what has changed? How are you going to know what has been impacted as a consequence of those changes? Because you will have dependencies among the requirements. And if you haven't recorded those dependencies, you won't necessarily know what the effect of one change to a requirement is. So that's something else you need to think about. How are you going to do that? So you got all that? Now it's time to make the decisions. First is, how are you going to record and express the requirements? Second one is, how are you going to discover and elicit the requirements? Who are you going to ask, or what are you going to look at to discover and elicit the requirements? Third thing is, how are you going to manage the requirements given that the requirements are likely to change? And the fourth thing is, how are you going to trace the requirements through to their execution and implementation, successful rollout?